for a lot of you, 2 days in a row following yesterday's talk from George Galloway. Talk today is going to be on the radical right in Britain. Now, in this country, we haven't had a history of extreme right-wing populist movements gaining any real degree of power or influence. And before I talk about those that have cropped up on the fringes of British politics, I just want to ask people why they think we uniquely really in European circles, why we haven't had in this country any real well-supported, genuinely credible radical right political party breakthrough. Because there are a number of very specific reasons, but there are also circumstances in Britain which maybe could have at various times encouraged that to happen. Daniel?
I think perhaps it might be a shame, sort of feeling of shame to the extent of imperialism in the past, which has sort of discouraged such sort of right-wing and fascism and whatnot. That's sort of encourages a sort of very aggressive foreign policy, and that's something that's quite discouraged since imperialism.
Excellent. So you're suggesting that kind of stigma about the British past, about our role in global history, kind of discourages people from that highly nationalistic tone of the far right strike. Sorry.
I think it's also to do with the background a lot, because when you see fascist parties and Nazi-style parties break through, their leaders are very often middle class, and they've often got a lot of support from the middle class. But whereas in Britain we've seen mainly in working class, who also vote for the far left as well. Excellent.
So you're saying we haven't had the right kind of leader breakthrough. That point I think is very, very interesting. You look at what's happening in France at the moment with the rise of the FN, and obviously there, the National Front as they are in France, there you have a leader in Marine Le Pen who is kind of someone that the middle class can feel comfortable about voting, who is attracted to the media, who's comfortable, who's confident, who doesn't present herself as the kind of thuggish, menacing figure that a lot of far-right leaders have traditionally been. Connor?
Relatively, we have a stable political and economic climate, and that's where the far right normally emerges as kind of a response to economic recession or political instability. And because of the stability that the UK has, it's unlikely that right-wing fascist groups, with extremist ones at least, would come up and gain any influence or significance.
Excellent. And that point about certain socio-economic factors fueling the rise of the far right, you'll see that in this country, where the far right has had some degree of success, it is because of those factors. But as Connor said, that's never been the national picture. It's been the picture in certain areas, and it still is, but it's never been the national picture, which means the far right have never been able to take advantage of that. Right.
I'm not sure where it really stems from, but I know the British, compared to especially Mediterranean countries, British media and the sort of intellectual British voice is just so cynical.
Yes,
and
yeah.
That's another reason why I think extremism tends to be scoffed at rather than generate the same level of support as it might be.
Absolutely, that's a very good point. The far right, and this is in no way a positive point about it, but the far right does have a radical vision for change, and it does, in case of some movements, it does proffer a totally different alternative to what the status quo offers, and we tend to be very cynical in this country about that. Emma, finally.
I think maybe we're just all very lovely people, but perhaps I think it's because Britain's had a history of being a very democratic, inclusive nation, which, with a large history of immigration, for example, particularly from the Irish in the 19th century, and compared to ethnic minorities in other countries such as Germany, around the same time, they are almost immediately included in the political life, because Britain has had a very healthy democracy and democratic rights have been extended to them for a very long time. So I don't think there's been more interaction and more mixing between people, and so you don't end up with alienated groups or groups cut off from one another.
Excellent. Or the chance of certain groups being scapegoated. Now, what I'm going to do, and I only want this to take about sort of 10 minutes or so that if there are questions or if there are points that you'd like to debate, there's time for that. I'm just going to quick whistle-stop tour of the British, I've called it radical right, because in some ways far right is quite a contentious term, and some of these groups would not see themselves as far right, but they might agree that they offer radical alternatives to the political mainstream. So we'll begin in the 30s with the British Union of Fascists. Now, the British Union of Fascists was founded in 1932 at a time when, going back to Connor's earlier point, at a time when there was a fair degree of social and economic strife in Britain. And to a degree, that fed into the formation of the BUF in 1932. The BUF was founded by Oswald Mosley, who in many ways was one of the most brilliant politicians of his generation. Usually in this country, far-right leaders are people that couldn't survive in a mainstream political party. They don't have the social skills, they don't have the kind of the ability to compromise or the willingness to rise to certain challenges. But Mosley was a brilliant politician. He was an incredible speaker, he was a very skilled organiser, he was charismatic to the point of exerting a kind of magnetic hold over his followers. He was originally a Conservative. He crossed the floor to join the Labour Party, which in itself was a radical move, and then he left the Labour Party to found initially the New Party, his own political party, but that morphed into the British Union of Fascists. Mosley modelled the British Union of Fascists very closely on the fascist movement in Italy, led by Mussolini, to the extent that the uniform of the BUF, the black shirt, was an exact copy of the black shirts that Mussolini's followers wore. Now, because of Mosley's personal qualities, because of his reputation in politics, and because of the connections he had, the membership of the BUF rose quite rapidly, so that within a year of its foundation it claimed a membership of 50,000. And its membership was a fairly diverse one, and you see this with the far right. They don't necessarily appeal to any one group. There's quite a kind of a grab bag of followers behind a lot of the far right. And in Mosley's case, he himself was from an aristocratic background. He came from a titled family, he had a lot of money behind him when he got into politics, and he had a lot of aristocratic connections. And therefore, when he launched the British Union of Fascists, he had a lot of support from the British aristocracy, the British upper class. He was very close, for example, to Lord Rothermere, who was the owner of the Daily Mail, and Rothermere actually produced a front page headline in January 1934 saying "Hurrah for the black shirts," suggesting that Mosley was going to be the person to kind of break Britain out of this deadlock between a Labour Party that for Rothermere seemed to be threatening socialism, and a Conservative Party which no longer stood for the hard right principles that Rothermere felt it should. So he had a lot of connections with the rich and the powerful, and he also had some working class support. Not a massive amount, but some working class support. Now, Mosley felt, because he was a skilled politician, he felt that his own personal appeal and some of the ideas that his movement put forward would be enough to win him some degree of power and influence. But time and time again, whenever the BUF put candidates up, they flopped totally. They failed at the ballot box. They never made any breakthroughs. And by the mid-30s, because electorally they were being repelled, people didn't like fundamentally the kind of hardline, right-wing, in many ways authoritarian, dictatorial programme that Mosley was offering. Because of that, he took his politics to the streets. He, rather than contest elections, he decided the way for the BUF to get a reputation, the way for it to win followers, the way for it to gain prominence was to actually take his political ideals to the streets. And he organised a series of mass meetings. These mass meetings were often stormed by communists and other anti-fascist demonstrators, and you regularly had fights at these meetings, fights spilling out into the streets. The police were regularly involved, often, it has to be said, backing up the BUF at the time, but generally violence became synonymous with Mosley's movement. And in many ways, his final flourish and his defeat happened in October 1936, the so-called Battle of Cable Street, where he wanted to march his BUF through Cable Street, through the East End of London, and through the heart of any far-right movement, the BUF needed an other. It needed an enemy, it needed a scapegoat, and at the time, that was the Jewish community. They were the most recognisable other, and he wanted to march through what in many ways was their kind of their heartland in London. He couldn't, because you had about 250,000 anti-fascists turn up, trade unionists, communists, members of various Jewish community organisations, and they physically blocked off the route that Mosley wanted to take. In the end, Mosley got nowhere close to Cable Street, because the main fighting that day was between the police, who were trying to clear a path for the fascists, and the anti-fascists. But in the end, the police recognised that with that level of resistance, there was no way that Mosley was going to survive a march through that area. In the end, the march was rerouted, it petered out, and in many ways, that was the end for the BUF, because they failed electorally, and they'd also failed on the streets. Mosley did have a kind of a second coming, but a very brief one, in the late 1950s, when he saw there was a lot of tension between white working class communities and newly arrived West Indian immigrants in Notting Hill, the 58 Notting Hill riots. Mosley wanted to take advantage of that. He wanted to try and up the tension, try and regenerate the BUF, or the union movement as it became then, but in the end, again, he was utterly rejected at the ballot box. Okay, we now move on to the post-war era. So immediately after the Second World War, Mosley, as a point of interest, Mosley was interned during the Second World War. He was put in a prison camp, as were other high-profile British Union fascist members, because the fear was, if Hitler did invade, then Mosley and the BUF would be a fifth column. They would be the enemy within. They would be the people that would actually support an invasion, and in many ways help the Nazis to topple any British resistance. So after the war, as I said, Mosley surfaces again briefly in '58, but there's a lull in the activity of the far right, and for what obvious reason? Why does even the most ardent far right organiser not attempt to launch any mass movement in that immediate post-war period? Connor.
Because they'd seen the result of Hitler and his far right ideals, and I think there was kind of an enlightenment across the world, that the far right kind of led to very extremist, very radical, and very violent ends, to means to achieve their ends. So there was a massive amount of reluctance to allow any right-wing tendencies to appear on the political spectrum.
Excellent. Yeah, and a lot of people who may have been partly sympathetic to some kind of fascist or Nazi programme, like you say, they recognise that ultimately it does lead to the gas chambers, and in terms of your credibility to be associated with that would have been political suicide.
And post-war part of the reaction was unity, building bridges between European nations, and
absolutely
kind of was a memento of a national and international idea of cooperation, and so that there's not strategically any room for a right-wing party to get any prominence.
Excellent. Yeah, there was a feeling that cooperation rather than kind of strife between nations, and a kind of like you say, negotiation, trade, diplomacy. That was the way that Europe was going to be rebuilt after the Second World War. But by the late 60s, you have really the next major group to be launched, the National Front. The National Front, in many ways, still today remains, certainly for people of my generation, the kind of the stock image of the far right, the kind of the Rights for Whites programme, the sort of skinhead street-based following. In many ways, the National Front, a lot of people's image of the far right, certainly as I say, people of my generation, is shaped by the National Front. Now the NF employed a two-track strategy. They believed that, and this was influenced by groups in mainland Europe who were doing well, like the MSI in Italy, neo-fascists who had emerged in various European nations and were beginning to win a degree of power and influence. This two-track strategy combined fielding candidates for election at local and national level with street-based violence. The two went hand in hand. And the NF had this idea that you could be a political soldier. You could be someone that could deliver the rhetoric, could deliver the speeches, could convince people to vote for you, but you could also be someone who could bash heads together on the street. the two things could be combined in one kind of idealised far-right political warrior. Now, the NF had, again, like the BUF, it had some degree of support, some following, mainly in the East End of London and also in the East and West Midlands. And the NF begins a strategy as well, or not a strategy, but there's a degree of kind of tapping into from the NF, something that the EDL take to the next level. They look towards the kind of the growing football hooligan movement in Britain at this time, the late 70s. And if you went to West Ham or Millwall, Newcastle, Leeds, a number of clubs got reputations for being extremely racist, for tolerating hard right elements within their fan bases. And outside these clubs, you used to get the Bulldog, the National Front's newspaper, regularly being sold. So they tapped into that kind of reservoir of young men who were up for a fight, who wanted very simple, kind of slogan-driven politics and wanted an enemy who they could target. The NF, again, in terms of electoral success, they had very little. They in local elections, their best results were in the East Midlands, in Leicester. Towards the end of the 70s, they were polling at certain times about 20% across areas like Leicester, but they never came close to winning any seats, winning any degree of influence. And for that reason, you see, Chris, if you skip forward for us, you see the breakaway faction in the shape of the BNP. Formed as a breakaway by John Tyndall in '82. Nick Griffin, leader of the BNP since 1999. Now, the BNP is founded initially because there were people in the NF who felt the NF wasn't intellectual enough, which was in itself a fair criticism, but they believed that you could put together a far-right party which would have genuine appeal. It would appeal to the kind of the people that wanted aggro on the street, but it would also appeal to the more kind of conservatively minded working class, lower middle class voters who certainly by the early 80s were beginning to feel like there wasn't necessarily a political party batting for them. So you get the foundation of the BNP. Griffin's been the leader since '99. First breakthrough for BNP comes in '93 when they win their first council seat. And at the time, I can't stress how shocking that was. The media kind of were all over it as a story that was reported with kind of horror and outrage. Their candidate won the seat of Millwall in the Isle of Dogs in the East End of London. It's a pocket of white working class settlement, very deprived, and it was an area that was just beginning to feel the impacts of immigration, principally from Bangladesh, which had been felt by a lot of East London earlier. So you were beginning to get Bengali families housed on the housing estates of the Isle of Dogs, where before you had a kind of a sons and daughters housing policy, where if you had a council flat on an estate, when your son and daughter came of age, they would get their own council flat on that estate. People began to feel squeezed out. The BNP put up he was an unemployed van driver, a guy called Derek Beacon, very politically very simplistic, inarticulate, struggled to kind of string a sentence together, but was seen to represent the authentic voice of the alienated white community of the Isle of Dogs. And because the local Labour Party had to a certain degree ignored the area, it had been safe for a long time, there was very little campaigning going on, there was very little engagement, the BNP slipped in, took that council seat on the back of this kind of disengagement and disillusionment. It was won back swiftly by the Labour Party, but it served as a warning shot. And then the 2009 local elections, after those local elections, the BNP has 55 council seats. It's the official opposition at this point in Stoke-on-Trent, in Barking and Dagenham, and also in Burnley. So it's a large block, a very large block. And I spoke to people recently who were campaigning in campaigning in Dagenham during the 2009 local elections. The BNP put up 13 candidates. They won 12 of the council wards they contested. And this guy said that he felt if the BNP had put up more candidates, they would have won more seats, and potentially they could have run the council, It's a London Borough Council with a budget of several hundred million. We've currently got only 2 BNP councillors sitting in this country. They were wiped out in Barking and Dagenham in 2010. Nick Griffin challenged Margaret Hodge, the Labour MP for the parliamentary seat in 2010, defeated very strongly. It was an increased majority for Labour, despite the classic BNP tactic of picking up on resentment locally amongst white working class communities and feeding that resentment with a series of myths. For example, Griffin made up this scheme, Africans for Essex, where he said that Barking and Dagenham Council were giving West African families £50,000, which they could use to buy a council house in Barking and Dagenham, depriving white families who'd been on the list for many years of any opportunity to actually get that council flat they deserved. So again, feeding into local resentment, feeding into the kind of the white working class sense of alienation from the political process, but in the end, not in any way having the kind of respect or credibility they needed to win. You've also got Nick Griffin and Andrew Bronze in the European Parliament, and it'll be interesting to see whether Griffin, who's the only BNP MEP, because Andrew Bronze now stands as independent, whether Griffin loses his seat in the European elections that we're due to have in just over a month's time. Because in many ways, the BNP's on its last legs. Griffin's had to declare bankruptcy. The party doesn't have the kind of money that will allow it to fight any kind of real campaign in these European elections, and certainly not in 2015. So to a degree, the BNP, as a far-right force, appears, at least temporarily, to be finished. And now we move on to more recent developments. The EDL, founded in 2009, following a demonstration by Al-Mujahirun, an Islamic extremist group, who demonstrated against a series of parades that had been organised by returning British service personnel to Luton. There was a lot of anger at the fact that these British service personnel who fought in Afghanistan, fought for Britain, kind of put themselves in the line of fire for Britain, were then greeted with abuse, with a degree of really fierce hostility when they returned to Luton. And as a result of that, you had the English Defence League form. Its leader, Stephen Yaxley Lennon, aka Tommy Robinson, he took his name, Tommy Robinson, from a guy who wrote a couple of books on Luton Town's hooligan firm, Men in Gear. The English Defence League is formed. It claims to be anti-racist, and there are members of the English Defence League from a range of different ethnic backgrounds. It claims that the real enemy for them as an organisation is extremist Islam. That is the kind of enemy they formed to fight. They say they have no kind of opposition to multiculturalism, no opposition to minority ethnic groups expressing their cultural identities in Britain, and no opposition to further immigration into Britain. Their opposition is purely to Islamic extremism. But fundamentally, you look at the nature of EDL demonstrations, you go to an EDL march, you listen to any kind of EDL speeches, you read any EDL flyers, and what comes through is the classic far-right idea of white Britons becoming strangers in their own land, of an alien culture driving out British values, of British ideals being swamped by a kind of a system, a belief system, which is totally foreign to us. So again, although they claim not to be part of the far right, they in many ways match that description. And then finally, we come to UKIP. Now, obviously, it's provocative and deliberately so to put UKIP alongside groups like EDL, who are associated really with little more than violence, hooliganism, and kind of gut-up racism. But if you look at the politics of UKIP, I think there is a lot of parallels to be drawn. Founded in 1993, principally on the basis of leaving the European Union. Nigel Farage has been leader since 2006. It won 9 seats in the 2009 European elections. Ironically, obviously, because they are strongly anti-European, they're happy to take the European pound. They're happy to take the £250,000 a year's salary that comes with being MEPs, but they are not willing, if you look at their attendance records, they're not willing to take part in votes. They rarely turn up to debates. There's the odd grandstanding moment like Farage giving Herman Van Rompuy a sandblasting the president of the European Union, but generally there's very little activism. If you elect someone from UKIP, you're not going to get someone who sweats blood for you in the European Parliament. A lot of UKIP candidates in the past have been paper candidates. They've been people who've agreed to have their name put on a ballot paper, but they aren't going to do any work for you as a constituent if you actually elect them. Now, what I really want to talk about for the remaining couple of minutes is whether people believe, from what they know about UKIP, they fit into that kind of far-right slot on the political spectrum, or whether it's unfair to characterise them as sharing common ideological ground with those other groups. I mean, does anyone feel that actually UKIP shouldn't be classified like that? They have a different agenda, or is it fair to kind of put them in that particular place? Because at the moment there's a real debate as to how much of an extremist, radical right populist force they can be classified.